Hi, everybody. The goal of this video is to provide a review for the final exam that goes over some of the major ideas from each of the weeks leading up from the midterm through the final exam so that you can feel prepared and know some of the areas that you can focus on as you gear up for the final. Just a couple logistical notes. The final exam study guide is available on Moodle, as well as practice questions, both multiple choice and short essay. You can also submit to me your practice short essay responses as an email if you would like feedback on those. And the final is held between the 12th and the 15th. The final exam is not cumulative in the sense that it doesn't have specific terms or concepts from the first half that you'll be asked to answer as questions, but these concepts and ideas from the second half do build off of ones from the first half. So I encourage you to review any sort of notes or material from the first half of the course, in addition to preparing for the new content from this half. So let's get into it. So coming out of the week of the midterm, we got into a unit in week 8 surrounding argumentation, narrative rhetoric, and media. Our focus on that Monday was on argumentation and trying to understand the structure of arguments. So one thing that I would highly encourage you to focus on as part of that is breaking down the different parts of the Tolman model. You might recall the bow and arrow example that we used to break down elements including claim, data, warrant, and so on. So being able to identify and differentiate those parts is important to focus on. Additionally, knowing some of the different ways that arguments function. So one question that came up was the idea of a syllogism and an enthymeme. So a syllogism is going from a major premise to a minor premise to a conclusion. So if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. An example of a syllogism is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. In other words, using an argument that's built off of pre-existing and understood concepts to reach a conclusion. An enthymeme is the idea of a syllogism, but one of the premises is implied or not explicitly given. So for example, if you just said Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, what would be implied in the enthymeme is that all men are mortal. So oftentimes in daily language, we'll use an enthymeme where part of the argument is just implied rather than directly stated. Another element to think about here is the role of narratives, the idea of putting together and fashioning stories, and specifically thinking about the ways that we critically evaluate narratives, including on the basis of probability and fidelity to assess the truth value of the narrative and whether or not the narrative feels internally consistent. After that, in week 8, we moved into week 9's discussion on rhetorical agents and agency. This is kind of a major point of discussion in the class, this idea of agency. Who has agency? How is there a development of agency, for example, a persona or identity that somebody has that they're able to practice in the world? What efforts are used to diminish or discredit agency? So for in the context of the Yurgao reading that we saw in today's presentation, this idea of diminishing the agency or credibility given to a person is important, as well as the idea of ethos, somebody's credibility and background that shapes the structure and organization of the arguments that they make. So the idea of agency and understanding how agency functions, who is able to speak and how are they able to speak, is an important one for this class too. In week 10, we looked at both media studies and rhetoric ideas surrounding audience. How do we come to understand and think about audience's relationship to the world? So these two approaches differ a little bit insofar as rhetoric looks at the rhetorical audience, that is the audience that's capable of persuasion or being moved within a larger group. Whereas in the context of media studies, we understood audiences to be really active and agentic participants. In a media studies context, audiences are people who are not just tuning in, but they are talking about, they're thinking about movies after they see them. They're engaging with each other and they're engaging with elements of fan culture as a way of thinking about their relationships to the world. So this connects pretty closely to some of the ideas that came in from Melanie's presentation with the class earlier in the semester. Additionally, we talked about the idea of situation. So we might recall Bitzer's concept of the rhetorical situation, exigence, audience, and constraints that comes together to form what we establish as a situation in our lives. We also can understand, as mentioned in the Media Studies Toolkit, the elements of citizenship, how we as participants are in relationships with and engagement with media, and how our participation with media shapes our understanding of the world. What does it mean to be an active participant, somebody who follows the news and that pays attention to media content in our lives? And we use the idea of symbolic action as a way to advocate and respond to the events that we see around us. In week 12, we had a short unit before the Thanksgiving break talking about public and counter-public spheres. So understanding, first of all, that there's both personal, technical, and public spheres in which argumentation and rhetoric take place. Within the public sphere, we've talked a bit about some of the challenges. What does it mean to establish a public? Do we have a public sphere anymore? And some of the ways in which a counter-public emerges oppositionally, given that the needs and issues identified by a larger public might not account for the diversity of voices and perspectives that need to be captured. And counter-publics, as oppositional spaces, face a number of challenges. For example, reinforcing some of the same harms of the dominant public and trying to figure out how to move between the needs of their own communities as well as the larger public. And then the last bit of new content that we went over was discussing media and public screens. So the idea that we talked about here is what is new and or mass media. That's something that has shifted in definition and application over time, right? We are always seeing new iterations of phones, of technology, and those changes and how we respond to those changes alter what we think of as quote unquote new media. One challenge as well is how we ethically engage in media. What challenges are proposed by things such as algorithms and technology that shape how we engage and understand each other? And also to go along with that, the DeLuca and Peoples reading on the public screen looked at how the public screen emerges as a space of online discourse and mediated discourse, but also engages with some of these ethical challenges surrounding the quality of these kinds of settings as well. So this covers major ideas and concepts that we went over in the weeks leading up to the final exam. Again, I encourage you to review the study guide and let me know if you have any questions ahead of taking it starting on Tuesday.